So a lot of these regulations are focusing on connectivity, cybersecurity. What do you do when the bridge and the engineering are, again, shoreside and maybe not on the ship?
Hi, welcome to the Captain's Log, the podcast where we chart the transition from traditional seamanship into the age of maritime autonomy. I'm your host, Elizabeth Fortunato. And today joining me is Greg Singer, a senior maritime litigation attorney from Lochner Law Firm and a leading mind behind boatinglaw.com. Greg specializes in the high-stake domain of marine law, and he's going to introduce himself a little bit so we can get a background on him. He's got a really fascinating history and how he comes at his practice. So Greg, welcome to the AI Captain's Log.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for inviting me. So I really came up through the hawse pipe. I started out as a sailor, working on private yachts and tall ships. I got my ticket and eventually did some cruising on my own in the 20s, or in my 20s. And then after a few years of cruising and working on ships, I decided I didn't want to be doing it when I was 60. And so I became a maritime lawyer to help support all the folks in the industry I've always worked with, brokers and captains and insurers. So right now my practice is about 50% transactional. With the tariffs, obviously, we're doing lots and lots of offshore flagging. And then the other half is going to court and litigating, typically for boat owners as against their insurance companies who don't want to pay their claims. Or what we call splash and crash, which is ships running into each other, running into fixed objects, and unfortunately sometimes injuring some people. This month, my firm is working on the Dolly case, which is the key bridge collision. So that I can't talk about that much, but it's certainly pretty interesting, and I think is going to touch on a lot of the concepts that we're looking at today, as far as where's the intersection between new technology and seamanship.
Yeah, for sure. This is if anybody's interested in the Dolly case, it did affect the Baltimore area and the Key Bridge. Believe that was about maybe a year ago, year and a half ago at this point.
Yeah, 2 years ago, almost to
Almost
the
2
day.
years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So yeah, that was a really big deal, and I know a lot of people still are. It's very fresh in everyone's mind, and anyway, we can't talk about it in detail. There is some stuff going on currently with it, but if you're all are interested in that, please look it up in the news. It's fascinating what's happening with that case in itself. But anyway, so let's really talk about, I really want to start with that rule number 5 and the beginning here as we start talking, because rule number 5, I did a little bit of research, and apparently, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it is one of the rules that actually gets most often cited when it comes to litigation in terms of the COLREGs. And rule number 5 states that you have to have a lookout. In fact, it says proper lookout by sight and hearing, as well as all available means. So if we're thinking about, high-end sport fishermen or custom yachts have pretty large technology budgets and can spend money to install advanced computer vision with lookout platforms to gain an edge, especially those fishermen that are out there offshore trying to win those contests. On the one hand, this technology is great. It introduces predictive awareness, precision over human fatigue. But from a legal perspective, how would a court see AI-driven computer-enhanced thermal imaging fusion stack as a legal requirement of its available means under Rule 5?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And taking a step back into the context, the COLREGs, which we're speaking of, the rules of the road, address one, fairly narrow but important area of seamanship, which is collision avoidance, right? And a hallmark of that is Rule 5, that you need to have a proper lookout, which means by visual and, audio listening, plus any other available means. So the most interesting question for AI and unmanned vessels is, can you maintain a proper lookout, either by having somebody remotely looking out, somebody, as with drones, sitting in an office somewhere shoreside, or for fully autonomous technology, can AI be that lookout? I think right now the answer is no. Only because the COLREGs didn't really contemplate that. There's a great Fourth Circuit case, which is the Mid-Atlantic Court of Appeals, just below the Supreme Court, that kind of rules the day on the lookout rule. It's an old race boat called Coyote. There's a great movie about it. I think it's the Mike Plant story. But there was a single-handed racer on this boat, and single-handed racing has the same problem, right? How do you have a lookout if you, as a practical matter, you have to sleep? So you have this sailing vessel in the middle of a race, and it hits a fishing vessel, right? Sailboat hits fishing vessel, motoring underway. And the question is, who's at fault? So you'd think, well, power-driven vessel, sail-driven vessel. You'd think that, the sail-driven vessel is the stand-on. But the problem is that this guy was dozing or asleep at the wheel, as you do when you cross an ocean on your own. And so the ruling there was that, 100% liability on the sailboat, because he didn't maintain a proper lookout. So I think that for right now, an AI can certainly assist being a lookout, just like radar can, just like AIS can. The interesting issue is that if you have all available means to you to maintain a lookout, you have to use them. So for example, if you have radar, but you're not actively using it, or if you're not actively looking at it, that can actually generate liability that you wouldn't have if you didn't have radar on board. So I think it's the same issue, is that if you do have AI on board, if you're not using it, then somebody like me is going to come into court and say, well, you weren't following Rule 5 because you didn't have it operational, and maybe that could have avoided the collision.
Yeah, so I'm so fascinated by all this because I actually, I love the idea of self-driving cars. I love the idea of self-driving, obviously with somebody, with the human still there and keeping an eye out. But, so if I were to put this on my vessel, would I inherit more liability actually if I'm not using this system or using this system and sort of kind of deferring my situational awareness to my virtual first mate, saying, okay, I need to go, say I want to go get a cup of coffee. My husband's doing engine checks. I'm like, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly at the helm. I'm down below at, in the galley, getting a coffee, coming back up. My virtual assistant is actually looking out, going to alert me if it sees anything kind of strange, let me know what's happening. Am I actually introducing liability into that situation, or am I
Yeah,
limiting myself? Like, which one is it?
yeah. So again, if you don't have it on, because Rule 7 kind of reiterates all available means must be used if they're on board and operational. Same analogy with radar. So I think that if you're not using it, you definitely generate liability. I think if you are using it, first of all, you're much more, you're much less likely to have a collision if it's operating and you're listening to it. Unfortunately, as the rules are written, we're not quite there yet. So I think that if you did collide with something, obviously the AI is going to make that less likely to happen. But as written, you still need audio and visual surveillance. So if you have a screen, maybe you have a tablet that gives you a 360-degree view, I think there would be a very good argument that you are still maintaining a lookout. But if you're leaving the helm and relying on, say, just a radar alarm or an AI alarm, then I think a court is going to say, well, that's not sight and hearing, and therefore that's the biggest question in my mind. Can you maintain a visual and an audio watch at the same time?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. And there's no precedent yet, I don't think.
There's none. So here's a good question. There's lots of autonomous vessels out there, or
Yeah,
unmanned vessels, right?
yeah.
And where we are now in terms of regulation is kind of where aerial drones were maybe 15, 20 years ago. So they're happening. And is any single-handed sailor, going offshore and sleeping at the helm in violation of Rule 5? Yeah, yeah, most likely. Are all of these uncrewed vessels that are out there, or that are, being crewed remotely, are they in violation of Rule 5? Yeah, probably. Right now, they're operating under, government exemptions. So they're certainly allowed to do it. But if there is a collision, and there's been a couple, it hasn't been litigated. I really want it to, but it's
Yeah.
usually military or government, and it usually,
Hmm.
kind of gets settled out. But yeah, I think that ultimately they're going to say that, if it's unmanned, and unless we get better regulation, that it's going to be a violation of Rule 5. A month ago, so this is very prescient, the IMO just published its first guidance on AI and autonomous
Hmm.
vessels,
I saw
which
that. Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of organizations, not just the IMO, but some maritime law organizations, some shipping organizations, all over have. This has been the hot topic for 5 years. So what's really cool is there's at least a framework now. They have, I think, 4 levels, starting with what you and I are doing, which is human watchkeeping and operation assisted by AI, which is great. I mean, right, lowers operator fatigue, makes things easier, and then you move up the levels to a vessel that is being steered remotely, with crew on board.
So technically unmanned. That's what they're calling unmanned. Yeah.
Exactly. And then in theory, the third level is I guess, no crew on board, but you are still being piloted remotely. And I think that's where the most focus is, the idea of a master who is not on board the ship, and a bridge that is, sitting in an office somewhere, which creates really interesting issues, like cybersecurity is much more important now, right? Because these are big ships that can cause a lot of damage. So if you have a traditional ship, you can have pirates. but the captain and the engineers can always, shut down the engines. But if you have a crewless ship, what if somebody can take it over? So a lot of these regulations are focusing on connectivity, cybersecurity. What do you do when the bridge and the engineering are again shoreside and maybe not on the ship? And then level four, the fully autonomous vessels, which aren't there yet. But the IMO regulations lay out an equivalence where they're trying to see, if remote watchkeeping, right? So somebody's
Hmm.
sitting
Right.
shoreside with eyes and ears, looking at all the instrumentation. If that can be an equivalent to Rule 5, then it looks like that's the path that they're going to go. And some other flag states have gone that route, saying, if we can find that it is as good as human watchkeeping, then it can be acceptable.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating, especially for the USV and autonomous and truly autonomous when we get there. How that's going to play out with the COLREGs. Now, you mentioned IMO, and just so for people who don't know what the IMO is, can you just kind of give us an overview of what the IMO is and what it does?
Sure. So it's a UN agency that tries to apply uniform regulations to maritime operations, and it's tough. I'll put it in the context of some other regulations because there's a lot. So every ship is looking first at IMO regulations, and then they're looking at SOLAS, which is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. They're also looking for the bigger ships. They're looking at class certifications. So these are classes like DNV, RENA, Bureau Veritas that say when you have these big ships, they need to be built to these standards and continually tested. On top of that, you have flag state rules, which means that whatever country you're flagged in has certain rules about operations and manning and how you do things. And then for every country that you visit, you have port state controls. So, you might have a vessel that's flagged in Singapore that has to follow all the Singapore rules for the ship. But then when it comes to the US, it also has to follow all the US rules. Again, for operations, for equipment, and for manning requirements. How many crew do you need? What type of licensures do they need? So the IMO is well, one small set of all the regulations that commercial ships have to follow. But I think it's pretty important in being forward looking. And again, these are guidelines they're proposing now, but to have one uniform set of rules that will govern, how is AI, how is autonomous vessels, and how is remote watchkeeping going to work?
Yeah, the same thing that we're seeing sort of in the land, sort of the trucking industry with autonomous drivers and trucks. I do think we're going to eventually see that in the shipping industry. I think I see a lot more conversation happening in the shipping sort of industry with a lot of these technologies because it is those are bigger, more costly accidents, like the Dolly case, like we know, and like other cases, or in tugboats. And that kind of moves me into this next question I have about really thinking about these things is that, when we think about our mobile devices and versus traditional integrated systems like Garmin, Furuno, Simrad that can cost up to $100,000. With the recreational boat market and the 28-foot center console, which is really the most popular boat, at least on the Chesapeake Bay and a lot of areas, I think it's one of the highest selling size boats for whenever you are lake or ocean or bay fishing, doing anything with fishing or now, just recreational kind of picnic boats. But those systems are not getting always upgraded. When you buy a used vessel, you have, if you have your, like we had on our boat, an old Simrad system, we didn't really want to upgrade that system. We used the system, but we didn't really want to spend the money to upgrade the whole entire electronics, especially for a really old boat. So people are often going towards these navionics. There's also a couple other applications out there like that are just more homegrown, like not really homegrown, but the Wavy Argo can be loaded on your iPhone or tablet. And since 2010, this is really interesting, and you probably are familiar with this, but I did some research here. But in 2010, there's been multiple accidents where operators were found at fault by NTSB due to distraction or AKA violation of rule number 5 from cell phone usage immediately preceding the event or the accident. And considering this automation and rerouting systems that's possible on your mobile device and really looking at, they can actually help improve boating safety, especially if you have nothing, you're going from nothing to a navionics or, another software that's on your cell phone or your iPad. Does this actually introduce any issue here? Because when you have your mobile device, you also have things pop up on there like your TikTok or your messages from your friends all your text messages. So unless you have an isolated system, is my thinking, that actually has, your navigation on it, and you also have a cell phone that you're not using. So are we introducing some rule 5 issues with the cell phone and having all of these routing and automatic routing and all really these more newer software as a service type technologies on our mobile devices and on our iPhones? And I just want to say one more thing is that going into, I was looking at this incident in Biscay Bay in 2025 that happened with a tugboat and the 3 children that were actually killed in the sailing accident. The tugboat operator was just found liable because they actually were looking at their cell phone record, and they found that they were looking, I think, doing online shopping before the accident. So, I'm just wondering, is there more and more that's going to come up, even though we want to use these technologies? In other words, even though we want to use these technologies and these are great devices to use, and you don't have to put all this $100,000 into your used boat to get the systems, are we actually kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with this?
I think so, because we see it in the shipping context too.
Yeah.
We had a ship that went aground not too long ago. Can't talk too much about that, but it's been publicly reported. Captain and pilot on their cell phones. So the thinking is that it's not the technology itself, right? Because what's the difference between your iPad and your touchscreen Garmin? It's not that much different. But the thinking is number one, segregating the use. So if it means getting a separate iPad, for the cost, it's probably worth it, and have that dedicated. Or just have somebody who is not the lookout, who's not actively driving the boat, can do those things. And the other thing that's I guess a little bit surprising is, from what I've read at least, mounting it permanently somewhere on the dash. That seems to be the big issue. Is that we're used to looking at the GPS, looking at our gauges, and looking it around. And it turns out, at least the folks tell me, that when people take a similar device, an iPhone or an iPad, and they put it on the dash where they're not, holding it and sort of absorbing their attention. It opens up their peripheral vision. It puts it in the context of, okay, this is just one more screen, but I'm still looking around. So yeah, that's what I've been hearing again, is that really separating the devices if possible. I'm certainly guilty of it. When Navionics came out, I had a little Boston whaler and it didn't have GPS, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I realized that I was just sitting there looking at it. So I think those are the keys. Certainly, if there was an accident and somebody was on their cell phone, using it for navigational purposes, checking weather, things like that, and it was somewhere where they were still able to see out, look out at other vessels, that'd be a hard case. But if we see that somebody is, texting their ex, or sending work emails just minutes before the collision, I think, yeah, that's going to be automatic liability. Easy case to make.
Yeah, I think I know the case that you're talking about with the shipping captain, because I did read about that one too. That I think that was work related emails. Yeah. So I mean that happens. I mean, people were out there and you want to get out in the middle of you want to kind of it's a beautiful day out, you're looking out the window, you're like, oh, I guess, I can get out there. I don't have any meetings planned. Let me just jump on the boat. And your technology isn't isolated enough. And I guess the reason I asked that, even though we're talking about AI and unmanned vessels and how autonomous stuff will work, these applications are offering that. These applications are now saying, oh, well, we can do automatic rerouting, we can do all these things, and they are mobile based applications. They are not meant to go directly download onto your home and be that type of application. They're meant to reside on a tablet, they're meant to reside on a phone. So people are using them, and they're getting the technologies are getting better and better. So the big firms like the Navionics, the Furuno, the Simrad, they take time to update. They are very complicated. I believe they're more regulated in terms of what they can deploy, because they're specifically, for this navigation. So they have a little bit more stringent requirements in terms of distribution. And I think they do, at least. I could be wrong. But, these other applications, with AI coding and everything, I can make updates in like 2 minutes and release new technology, and boom, 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 I'm in automatic routing mode. I think we're going to see it increase. And so that's why I was asking the question, is that the technology is going to keep going and we got to be ready for it, right?
I think so. And there's, if you think about either a bridge in a ship or, even your own boat, there's a lot of screens, there's a lot of radios, there's a lot of
Yes.
inputs, there's a lot of switches, and it really wasn't an issue until we started having devices that did other things, right? Because with your Garmin chart plotter or your radar, you're not looking up songs. Your mind is not in another place. So I think that we're certainly capable of taking a lot of inputs and doing it safely. But every time work or home or anything else invades there, that seems to be where it draws the attention away, and
Yeah.
and certainly where the liability is.
And I swear every time I go to dock my boat, my mother calls me. I swear, I don't know how she has it, but I'm like,
She just
"I
knows.
didn't put it on do not disturb." I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah, surprisingly, there is not really, there's no COLREG there for commercial ships, there's plenty of rules, right? It's in their SMS, it's in a lot of regulations. But for you and I, there's not really any federal regulation against driving while texting or, it's really just embodied in Rule 5. So,
yeah,
maybe we'll see something like that. But yeah, especially with power boats, high speeds, nice flat day going 30 or 40 knots. That's when things happen when people are looking down at their cell phones.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's tough. And it's gonna. I think, like I said, it's gonna happen. It's gonna continue to happen more and more that people are gonna want to invest in this technology, or invest a lot less in the technology to help with the navigation and using mobile devices for that. So, I want to talk a little bit about now. And let's moving to rule number 2 here, which is really about that command responsibility. And I think, from what I understand, rule number 2 is sort of the catch-all. You're the lawyer here, but it's sort of like the catch-all kind of rule. Well, if all else fails, we're going to enforce rule number 2. But, when you have catastrophic system failures, like in massive commercial ships, like we saw with Dolly, and the legal fallout really centers on corporate asset management, compulsory, pilotage laws, crew liability, as we've seen in Dolly. All this is in the public sector, so I'm not trying to have you answer those questions, but contrast that with what we're seeing right now in the military sector and somewhat in the commercial space for ocean exploration, seafloor mapping, where fleets are deploying a lot of comprehensive marine autonomy tech stacks. We talked about this a little bit, and the remote control centers and operating vessels unmanned and remotely. How does rule number 2, this good seamanship rule, adjust for unmanned commercial vessels or a recreational boat using similar technology? We're not quite there yet from a recreational standpoint. That's future. But, when a warning is issued by the virtual first mate, like we talked about, and dismissed by the captain, similar to, I guess, what a pilot can do on a boat coming up the bay or into a harbor, if they give a captain direction, the captain can dismiss that pilot's direction. How would the courts now deliberate if the crew ignored a prudent precaution recommended by a virtual first mate that was logged in the system? Mind you, these all get logged. It's technology, it's all logged. So, in other words, is having the technology a liability or a benefit? Again, that question is, would it be, worse to have you be notified and then ignore it, or to have you notified and benefit from it? So,
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways this goes. So I'll first talk about Rule 2 as one of my first training captains called it the "Don't be stupid" rule. Rule 2 says that if you are following all the rules, that first of all, if you break a rule, you can always be liable for it. But second, if you are following all the rules, it doesn't relieve you of responsibility to follow what they call the ordinary practice of seamanship, right? Good, prudent seamanship. So, the classic is you have a sailboat who's the stand on vessel, and, a power boat coming up is a giveaway vessel, and the sailboat doesn't do anything, right? They just stay there. They don't alter course. They don't, sound anything. And they say, well, I'm in my rights. I'm just going to keep on going straight. But the rules say that, first of all, under Rule 2, whatever good seamanship is, you have to do it. And also under Rule 17, even a stand-on vessel, if you're close enough that collision can't be avoided, they need to take action. And there's a maritime law concept called in extremis, which says that if a collision is about to happen, both sides are responsible to take whatever action to avoid or mitigate it. So on the one hand, you have a set of rules, but you also have Rule 2 and 17 saying if you're about to get in a collision, you should be adding or even departing from these rules. So Rule 2 lets you depart from the rules if necessary. And that's where, to me, it gets philosophically interesting in an Isaac Asimov type way, right? You have the 3 laws of robotics. You have a set of COLREGs that presumably an AI would follow, and then uh, I'm sure it's practically possible. You also need to program it to depart from those rules under certain circumstances. I think the biggest problem is that when we talk about the ordinary practice of seamen, we're talking about what have seamen, and ships masters traditionally done, and they haven't done any of this AI stuff, right? So it's a little bit hard to justify, in the context of say an autonomous vessel, ordinary seamanship is having somebody on board. So it's a little bit tough, I think, for those guys to satisfy Rule 2 because again, this is all brand new. As far as I can you remind me what you asked about the military side?
Oh, really that sort of really what we're seeing this is in military and then potentially in commercial. And then lastly, the way this is progressing, it appears to be progressing, sort of lastly in the recreational boater world is that, if you have this kind of virtual assistant saying, hey, you really need to look out for this, or there might be a potential collision there, kind of like AIS on steroids, sort of like where we are with AIS right now is you can see it, some radar, you can have the radar, you can have it alerting, you can see another vessel, you can see it tracking in your radar, you can contact the other vessel. But, looking at that and sort of projecting out what your path is, what that vessel's path is saying to you, you get the little red line now, like danger, danger kind of on your radar. But that's all we have really right now, most of us. But if take that another step forward in the recreational space, and you've got a virtual first mate that maybe has a camera mounted, it has all these things, all these sensors logging and saying, hey, this is really, sort of going to happen. This is something you need to watch out for.
Y Yeah, so on that, especially on the recreational operational side, because I think we are gonna see I'll be honest, that probably the worst accidents I see again and again, aren't so much, we see some fires, we see some sinking, we see some docking problems, but that's gel coat and ego. That's all that is. But man, grounding really takes out some boats and often takes them out. And it turns out insurance coverage isn't available. You put your boat in a charter fleet and some credit card captain, decides to go 20 knots into a reef. And wouldn't it be great if there was a little AI that
Yeah.
would say, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm not going to do that. Or, would you like to proceed before you run aground on this reef? So I think the big question is that, if you have your AI telling you something, I think the question is, how confident are you? How much can you trust it? And the good news is that it works in a current legal framework where mariners are not supposed to trust any one source, right? They're supposed to be using their eyes, their ears, their AIS, their radar, all means available to evaluate any threats and to navigate safely. So, and in fact, there's even, I think it's in I want to say it's in Rule 7, but I might be wrong, where they tell you need to use all available means, including radar. And it's also included in the rule that you're not supposed to rely on scant information, especially from radar. So I think the answer is that if you were relying solely on your AI, on your AI watchkeeper, which in theory is taking in all these sources, I think that it might be a little bit foolhardy to do that. I think it's good to check it out. But if as a prudent mariner, if you're using your eyes and your ears and all the other data, including the AI, then I think that, as long as it's a reasonable decision based on the data, that you're going to be in the clear. The one really interesting part of this on the shipping side, when you talk about all this data, is that as you can imagine, commercial ships are now beaming back to the home office colossal amounts of data, and there's a really specific law called the Ship Owners Limitation of Liability Act in the U.S. And there's an analog in most countries. And what it says is that if you're a ship owner and there's an accident, you can limit your liability to the post casualty value of the vessel. So in something like the Dolly, where the vessel might and cargo might be worth 100 million and you have a several billion-dollar liability, the owners can traditionally limit their liability to just what the boat costs. In order to do that, they need to show that they didn't know what was going on, that they didn't have any connection to whatever it was that caused the accident. And the reason is because in the 1850s, if you owned a ship and you sent it out, you didn't have control of that captain. You didn't know what was going on in the boat. So how can you, have unlimited liability for that? But these days, that's really getting tested because, the home office is getting hundreds, probably thousands of alerts every day. They're getting a data overload. So on the one hand, they have probably too much data than they know what to do with, unless they can sift through it with AI. But at the same time, they're increasing their liability because, well, you had notice that, X, Y, and Z was wrong with the boat. So that's the really interesting part is, can you, again, 1850 ship captain, obviously the owner couldn't, be in touch with them. So the question It's very interesting to us, at least, because it determines, is this a $5 billion lawsuit or a $100 million lawsuit? Is, can any ship owner really say that they don't know what's going on with the boat anymore and therefore limit their liability?
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating because there is a lot of data going back and forth. I just released an article on Substack on digital twins, and they're using that more and more to really to talk about where your AI optimized route is going to be and how efficient that route is, and looking at all the factors that go into that. And the digital twin is helping sort of the more, I would say, progressive shipping companies. The idea is that that digital twin, if you have that exact replica where that data is coming back to, you can actually say how this ship can either speed up, slow down, diverge from this particular ship, route that you had planned, to really save on fuel, to really gain efficiencies, which goes into obviously helping the environment, helping the cost of the shipping and everything. So there is a lot of information going back and forth. And like I said, I think a lot of this stuff is going to happen in that commercial industry before it comes down to, I mean, maybe charter captains would be able to do that. Really sophisticated, very expensive. You talk about the credit card captain, but really sophisticated, maybe charter captains can do that. Cause I know the way a lot of things happen now is they have somebody, people do weather, updates from Bob or whoever, there's sort of their person on land who looks at the weather and looks at everything. But maybe if you have this on your own vessel, and this is getting to the question, is getting to if you have the own vessel and you can have all that data coming in, not being shipped anywhere, having all that data coming in, all that information, and you can look at your optimization and you can look at your own traditional channel, but then if something goes wrong, so say you have that happening, it's sort of like being on auto, your auto routing again on steroids, is that you have this all, in your system, your boat is actually saying, I think we need to adjust here, need to adjust there, and you're letting it do that. And then maybe something happens, maybe something, you get too close, you're not paying enough attention, you get close to the shore, there's a reef out there you didn't see or whatever, and you run aground. Then who actually fundamentally becomes responsible for that? Obviously, there's a lot of rules here. We've talked about Rule 5, we talked about Rule 2, but do you foresee any responsibility then going to the people that are actually developing the software, that are actually putting this stuff together and saying, okay, this is, based on the algorithms that we've done and tried and true, we've done this, scenarios like 100,000 times, and this is the best path forward, like an LLM model. This is the best path forward. This is the next word you're going to predict you're going to use. This is the next path. What could be the responsibility there, if there is any?
Yeah, I think that the software companies, at least, they do a pretty good job of limiting their liability. Every time you open up Navionics or Garmin, or frankly anything, you've always got a disclaimer, right? And it says you can't rely on it, and I think that's a good thing, because even NOAA charts have a disclaimer on them, right? That say, you can't absolutely rely on this. And there's so many other sources that a prudent mariner is supposed to consult. Not that we always do, but just for things like depths and channels, you've got your charts, you've got your electronic charts, you've got local notices to mariners, you've got the coastal pilot, and then you've got U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which in theory, a very prudent mariner would consult all of them. So I think the software companies are going to do a pretty good job. But I don't think it's going to matter, because I think they're going to get sued. Well, once in a while, somebody is going to get hurt. And some enterprising plaintiff's lawyer is going to say, well, it's the software, that hurt this. So I think the software companies will get sued, and that will probably, may shape the extent to which they're willing to let their software take over the boat. This is America. You can sue anybody, right? So I don't think there'll be a lot of liability for them, but I think that when we see the first lawsuits, we saw this a lot with fly-by-wire 20 years ago. It used to be you had physical cables connecting your helm and your throttle, and then they moved to fly-by-wire, and there were a lot of problems because people didn't know how to use it. There were delays. You'd try to, jam it in forward and it wouldn't do anything. So you jam it more. And then when the computer caught up, all of a sudden you're going, 30 knots at the dock. So, yeah, I think it'll help refine the technology and the boundaries of what they're willing to let the boat do. But fortunately, with all those disclaimers, I think they're going to be okay.
Okay. I just thought I, want to ask that because I know that, there's always liability. Everything we do in the US, we have to think about liability. Unfortunately, even if the person doing something has been really stupid, sometimes they get rewarded for being stupid.
Yeah, and again, maybe more than on the land side with cars, which are kind of a almost a human right or necessity. Maybe that's weird saying that, but we commercial boating is a necessity for the world. Recreational boating is not a necessity. So I think there's more comfort putting more responsibility on the master of the vessel. That even if you have AI helping you, you are ultimately responsible. So you have to be the ultimate decision maker.
Yeah. Yeah. And the where I s anyway, I mean, I know that certain companies like Brunswick are introducing technologies for self-docking. Not available on every vessel, obviously, but it is something that they're premiering at boat shows right now, and they're, talking about doing. And you think about, I mean, realistically, the objective of all of this is to make for safer boating. I don't think anybody's out there trying to make, this something that's bad for the boater. I'm just kinda talking about worst case scenarios, but the objective ultimately is for safer boating and to enable somebody who may not be as experienced to go into, say, a boating club or get into boating and enjoy boating because it is fantastic. We all love it. You love it. I love it. That's why we do it. But, giving that person the opportunity to succeed as opposed to having stress at the docks or, not always understanding the best path to take forward or best route to take. So it is really ultimately to help and to get us a little bit more advanced through technology. But
I think the docking is the coolest because I always call it docking drama. It's such a high stress point, and it's the kind of
yes,
thing that AI was made to do, right? It's slow, it's data heavy. You're not in the middle of the channel. Well, worst comes to worst, you take off some gel coat. But yeah, I think it's when I started coming up in sailing, the general wisdom was that 42 feet was the biggest boat any couple could really, reasonably handle, right? Just in terms of docking, in terms of systems and maintenance. And now, between IPS drives, bow thrusters, all the cameras, all the systems integration, couples that maybe don't have a ton of experience can get 50, 60-foot boats and be just fine. So I think it's really cool that the technology has allowed more people to get into boating. And it's still scary because if you're docking, especially a center console where you might have 600 horsepower outboards on it, it's controlling that engine.
yeah.
And in theory, it could go full throttle and do something. So the fail safes need to be there. But it does seem like they're doing a pretty good job so far.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone's drug runners now, but I can't believe the amount of horsepower I see on the back of some of these vessels. I'm continually shocked. I'm like, you need 4 quads for what?
Yeah. And I think also insurance will probably be a big driver. Insurance is pretty good at moving manufacturers in the right direction. The early IPS pods, they fell off all the time and it cost 20, 30 grand each time to, I mean, if you ran aground, they'd fall off. Really expensive to fix and usually doesn't completely fix it. So a lot of insurance companies said, we're not going to cover them, or there will be a high deductible, or, we're not going to cover a boat that has them. So I think that if insurance sees that they're getting less claims and they have that data, I think it's going to point them in the direction of, well, lower premiums, let's put them on boats. If they do see a lot of accidents, then I think they're going to start having warranties that, we're not going to cover this. So that they're kind of the bellwether for me of does this work?
Yeah. So before we get to the buoy run, the lightning round, like I like to do at the end, let me just ask you a quick question. So, do you think, and this is kind of getting us into the buoy round, but do you think Europe uses AIS a lot more than we do? I think it may be required in Europe on vessels before radar usage. I found that out recently doing another podcast that on radar. But so, do you think because of where AIS is and it's more achievable to put in some of these technologies than, radar is a big system. You have to have you have to have the array, you have to have all of the equipment on the boat to do radar. So do you think AIS is going to kind of creep in the way it is in Europe and be more of a requirement for in terms of alerting boaters in terms of potential hazards or someone who's nearby? Like, if you have somebody within your range, you set your AIS range, within, I don't know, 100 meters or something like that, 200 meters and they alert you that the boat's within that and they have AIS. Do you foresee that maybe
Yeah.
happening?
And just to be clear, are you talking about AI watch keeping on top of the AIS?
No, I'm
Or
just talking about
uh,
AIS in general because AIS is one of those additional input points for a lot of the AI systems that do operate. So, in terms of your sensor data you have on your boat, as well as AIS data and then radar data and all those different sort of data that comes into what would be sort of I'm big calling a virtual first mate. But the AIS, from what I understand, is not it's not required in the US to be used if you have it the same way radar is. So if radar you have it on your vessel, you're all goes into the all means. AIS is not one of those things right now, I think, that's required the way it is in Europe, or used more heavily in Europe than it is here. And I was asking if do you think AIS will then, because of these different technologies we're getting into, be something that's more often required in the future?
I think so. So Rule 7, says all other means generally, and it specifically calls out radar. I think shortly it will call out AIS, if it's installed on board, because more and more boats are getting it. It's become kind of fun. People like tracking their boats, looking at marine traffic. So, I never thought I'd see 30, 40-foot boats, that had AIS on them. So yeah, I would say I do think probably not mandatory. I think it's only mandatory for boats like over 65 feet on
Yeah.
ocean voyages or something like
Hmm.
that. I don't think it'll be mandatory, but it generates another issue that I'd be really interested in if AI can solve this, which is that if you're a commercial ship, you usually have to, I don't know, CPA of half mile or 1 mile when you're in port on your AIS alarm, right? So if you come into the port of Annapolis or the port of Baltimore, you've got all these recreational boats. They're just
Hmm.
sitting at the dock and they've all got their AIS on. So it can actually cause an alarm overload, right?
I
Because
had that happen.
yeah, and the answer is that you have to turn it off all the way. So I'd be
Yes.
very interested if AI could solve that problem and kind of filter and say, because it's pretty obvious which boats are at the dock and not moving,
Yes.
and which ones are anchored and not moving that you do need to worry about, and which ones are moving.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. Leaving the Baltimore Harbor in my Navionics system, we didn't have it hooked up to our SIMRAD, but my husband had hooked it up when we were there in Baltimore. And then, unbeknownst to me, he didn't tell me. He was like, "Oh, I turned it on, so now you can." He just told me, he goes, "Oh, log into," So he integrated everything. I get on the helm, doing my normal thing, using my Navionics, using everything, and then I'm getting AIS alerts on my SIMRAD, on my my Navionics. I was like, all these. I was like, the bells.
Yeah, which I think also with the AI Watchkeeper, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be some false positives on it, and they're meant to feed you as much data as you can as possible.
Mm.
So even a recreational boater, you might have that same problem as the commercial operators. I have so much information. How do I prudently resolve it to make decisions?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a little tense there for a minute trying to figure out how to turn them all off. Anyway, okay, so let's move on. So I like to do this kind of quick rapid fire thing at the end. I call it the buoy run. I love those docking contests and buoy runs, sort of like, rodeo, boat rodeo. So just sort of off the top of your head, kind of just hitting these questions up and so given what we discussed today, would you rather defend a mega yacht captain whose autonomous docking suite suffered a cloud connectivity dropout and crushed a concrete bulkhead, or an offshore tournament fisherman who completely deactivated the computer vision lookout because it was throwing false positive alarms while tracking fish entries in heavy sea state?
Ooh, I think I'd rather represent the mega yacht captain. And the reason is that if you can show a clear violation of a navigational rule, there's a maritime inference called the Pennsylvania rule that says if you violated a rule and it had anything to do with safety and it could have caused the accident, then the court's going to hold you liable. So if I have the sport fisher, I know for a fact that he's violated Rule 5. And if there's a collision, it's a good chance it's because of Rule 5. Whereas with the mega yacht captain, I can look at, did he maintain it properly? If it's an operational failure or a systems failure, it's a question of, was it negligently maintained or not? And could the captain take control afterwards? Which almost anytime you see a YouTube of a super yacht, hitting something, 9 times out of 10, it's something in the engineering department failed.
Yeah, it's interesting. We might even see some of this technology in mega yachts because they certainly have the same with sport fishing. When you're offshore, there's lots of money get poured into that helm. So who knows? Okay, so second question: given the custom yachts and sport fishing boats spend, again, like we're talking about, just mentioning tremendous capital on their technology, which of these innovations do you personally believe carries highest immediate legal liability for the owner? Autonomous docking and maneuvering assistance, crowdsourced auto routing with these SaaS platforms we talked about, or commercial remote control centers running unmanned vessels?
Ooh, I think it's the commercial remote control center for me because the autonomous docking, you know, not high speeds, doesn't even really involve the COLREGs in the first place. But with the commercial remote control, the problem is that it's not the ordinary practice of seamen. So where that I think is where the new technology hits hardest against the rules and the tradition that's baked into the rules. So I'm really excited about, remote watchkeeping, because how great would it be if we had all these mariners that go out for 6 months at a time and work 20-hour days, if they could be at home, if they could see their families, be more alert. But I think that's also the greatest legal pitfall, because what if you lose the connectivity? What if you end up having some kind of cyber attack on it? So unfortunately, while it's the coolest thing out there, I think it's that, remote watchkeeping or fully uncrewed vessels that is just the biggest legal liability.
Yeah, and you don't know. What if a drone goes, drone, I say, remote or USV goes missing? I mean, you don't know if it's gone missing because, of a bad actor, or it's gone missing just because it's lost connectivity. So, yeah, interesting. Okay, so question number 3. True or false? By the year 2030, marine insurance underwriters will explicitly refuse to write policies for any recreational commercial vessel over 50 meters unless it features an active data logging computer vision system to provide independent verification of a proper lookout. Rule number 5.
That's a pretty cool question. It's 2026 now, 2030. I'll
Soon.
go I'll go out on a limb and say yes, but I think because boats over 50 meters are all tied to class rules, I
Hmm.
think it's because the classification societies are going to get on board, because they're usually able to move a little bit more swiftly than, flag states or port control states. I think they're going to hop on and they're going to say, this is technology that to be in class, you need to have it, just like radar, just like AIS. And then once it's in the class rules, yeah, I do think insurance is going to make them have it.
Yeah, it is going to be interesting. I mean, this technology is moving fast. This is why I want to start this podcast. I just think it's fascinating, and we're going to see all this in our lifetimes. I mean, I'm hopefully in my lifetime. Gosh, I don't think I'm. I mean, getting older every day, but hopefully I'm not that short a stick on. You didn't draw the short stick on that one.
It it's been the greatest boon to the recreational boating industry. It didn't necessarily stagnate in the 90s and
Mhm.
2000s, but there wasn't a lot going on. Maybe the move from inboard to outboard motors, and maybe the move away from epoxies that, or salt, that caused osmosis blistering. Other than that, not a lot happening. And then all of a sudden, between COVID and the technology that allows, many, many, many more people to go boating and to do it safely, boating has never been more popular, and I think it's all because of the technology.
As well as the onset of the boating clubs, I think those have made a difference too in terms of what being required, for people to go out in terms of lift, and people can get out on a boat, and sometimes a nice boat, nice vessel without the big upfront, cost of getting into a boat and the insurance and all that stuff. You just join a boating club, and then you have limited your costs, and you can still get on the water. So
Yeah,
I think we're going to see more and more of it.
huge fan. I'll give a pitch. Well, not for any particular one. I have a powerboat. I have a sailboat. I'm also a powerboat club member, and I'm also a sailboat club member. And I think the new clubs are great, because the old ones, it used to be we only want experienced sailors for our boats, and the
Mhm.
new ones say, you know what, we get new boats every 3 years. Here, I don't want to say they don't care if you scratch it up, but they give you good training, and they say, look, don't worry about beating it up. Don't worry about scratching it up. And that alone gets so many people out boating
Yeah.
without that drama, without that worry and that fear. And once you're off the dock, you just love it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's the best. All right, Greg. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us kind of navigate that digital cross currents and helping us align tech with the realities of maritime law. Certainly, I think we have a lot that's going to happen in the next 5 years. I want to thank our listeners, our captains, our fleet managers who also want to ensure their bridges remain completely compliant. You can track down Greg and his elite team at Lochner Law Firm at boatinglaw.com. So thank you again for joining me, and I really appreciate it. And this is Elizabeth Fortunato with the AI Captain's Log. So fair winds and following seas. Thanks so much.